The 1990s gave us more than just futuristic fantasies. It gave us brutal visions of dystopia that governments tried to silence. These weren't your typical popcorn flicks. These were films so raw, violent, and boundary-pushing, they faced bans, edits, and outrage. Here are 13 of the most brutal 90s sci-fi movies that faced censorship, counting down from the darkest shadows of cinema. Number 13. Fortress, 1992. Imagine a future where having more than one child is a criminal offense. That's the chilling premise of Fortress, a low-budget but high-intensity sci-fi thriller directed by Stuart Gordon. Set in a dystopian 2017, the film follows a couple imprisoned in a state-of-the-art underground penitentiary for violating a strict population control policy. What ensues is part prison break, part technological nightmare. The brutality of Fortress isn't in massive battles or explosions. It's in the psychological warfare, invasive surveillance, and biotech torture devices. One particularly disturbing detail: prisoners have intestinators implanted, which explode if they step out of line. Censors took serious issue with the film's depiction of institutional brutality and bodily punishment. In Australia, the film was initially refused classification until scenes involving intestinal torture were trimmed. In the UK, it passed with an 18+ rating, but only after heavy edits to scenes depicting internal explosions and a sadistic mind control device. Even in the US, the MPAA pushed back on some sequences, requiring cuts to tone down the gore and the claustrophobic body horror. Fortress didn't enjoy mainstream box office success, but it became a VHS cult classic. It resonated with audiences who saw real-world parallels in governmental overreach and surveillance anxieties. Over time, it gained a reputation as one of the grittier dystopian visions of the decade. Ironically, the censorship only enhanced its mystique. Fans hunted for uncut versions, and today, it's praised for being ahead of its time, more prophetic than pulpy. In the annals of 90s sci-fi, Fortress remains a brutal, unforgettable warning of control gone too far. Number 12. Hardware, 1990. Dusty, decaying, and drenched in dread. Hardware is cyberpunk on steroids. Directed by Richard Stanley, this low-budget British-American film paints a bleak future where radiation-soaked Earth is roamed by scavengers and ruled by technology. The story revolves around a killer robot, reassembled from military junk, that comes alive inside a cramped apartment and turns into a murder machine. From the moment it starts, Hardware feels like a hallucinatory fever dream. The color palette is rust, blood, and neon. The score pounds like a dying heartbeat. And the violence? Relentless. Victims are torn apart by spinning blades, electroshocks, and the machine's cold precision. The British Board of Film Classification, BBFC, demanded several cuts before allowing release, particularly targeting a prolonged and disturbing sequence where a woman is terrorized in her home. Critics blasted the film for its intensity. In the US, the MPAA gave it an X rating before it was trimmed to qualify for an R. What made Hardware especially controversial was its nihilism. This wasn't a tale of triumph over evil. It was a warning about technological autonomy and government apathy. It resonated with the underground punk community and cyberpunk fans, but horrified mainstream audiences and censors alike. Despite, or because of the backlash, Hardware has grown into a cyberpunk cult legend. It anticipated themes later explored in films like The Matrix and Ex Machina, but with far more grit and gore. Today, it's a reminder that even small-budget cinema can punch above its weight. and sometimes gets censored for being a little too real. Number 11. Starship Troopers, 1997. Don't let the sleek effects and satirical sheen fool you. Paul Verhoeven's Starship Troopers is one of the most brutal science fiction epics of the 90s. On the surface, it's a space opera about Earth soldiers battling giant alien bugs. But underneath, it's a savage critique of militarism, propaganda, and fascism dressed in shiny sci-fi armor. The film features dismemberments, gory impalements, and disturbing death sequences that rattled censors worldwide. The infamous brain-sucking scene, where a creature pierces a man's skull to extract information, was a focal point of censorship debate. Countries like Germany and the UK issued age restrictions and censored marketing material, while others demanded trimming of specific scenes. In the Philippines, where themes of authoritarianism hit close to home, the film was briefly banned for being morally damaging. Critics were also divided. Some thought it glorified fascism rather than satirizing it. Yet over time, Starship Troopers flipped its reputation. What was once seen as a hyper-violent space war flick became appreciated for its ironic detachment and clever commentary. It mocked the very systems it depicted, and its over-the-top gore served to amplify the absurdity of war glorification. Today, Starship Troopers is celebrated for its layered storytelling, visual spectacle, and ahead-of-its-time messaging. Still, it remains one of the few mainstream 90s blockbusters that had to cut scenes, not for suggestiveness, but for sheer brutality. Number 10. Tetsuo 2, Body Hammer, 1992. If David Cronenberg had nightmares inside a Japanese cyberpunk arcade, they'd look like Tetsuo 2, Body Hammer. Directed by Shinya Tsukamoto, this sequel to the infamous Tetsuo. The Iron Man pushes the boundaries of body horror and mechanized madness. It follows a seemingly average man who mutates into a biomechanical weapon of vengeance, his body literally turning into metal and guns. The transformation sequences are grotesque. Flesh tears. Screws pierce muscle. Skin becomes armor. But this isn't just gore for shock value. It's a metaphor for rage, trauma, and the dehumanizing force of urban life. The film was so intense that censors in several Asian and European markets demanded edits. Japanese home video versions were initially released with disclaimers, and German censors flagged the movie for scenes excessively focused on bodily mutilation. Some underground festivals in the US screened the uncut version, but it was rarely shown in mainstream theaters due to its hyper-aggressive visuals. Critics were polarized. Some called it an avant-garde masterpiece. Others dismissed it as sensory overload. But fans of experimental cinema embraced Tetsuo 2 as a raw expression of technological anxiety. Over time, it's become a cult staple, influencing directors from Darren Aronofsky to the Wachowskis. Still, it remains difficult to watch, and even harder to forget. Brutal, bizarre, and deeply symbolic, Tetsuo 2. Body Hammer didn't just face censorship, it welcomed it, wearing it like a badge of defiance. Number 9. Event Horizon, 1997. A haunted house in space. That's how many describe Event Horizon, but that doesn't begin to capture the terror this film unleashed. Directed by Paul W.S. Anderson, this sci-fi horror hybrid stars Lawrence Fishburne and Sam Neill aboard a spaceship that mysteriously returns after disappearing into a black hole. What they discover isn't science. It's hell itself. The film was notorious before it even hit theaters. Paramount Pictures forced Anderson to remove nearly 30 minutes of footage from the original cut, fearing it was too disturbing for wide audiences. The lost material reportedly featured graphic hallucinations, images of mutilated bodies, and scenes of agonizing torment aboard the ship. What remains is still horrifying, but the uncut version became a whispered legend among horror fans. In Europe, several TV versions of the film removed or blurred scenes involving gore and psychological breakdowns. Even the MPAA originally considered giving it an NC-17 rating, pushing Anderson to trim the now famous blood orgy footage during the ship's black box replay. But beyond the violence, it was the bleak nihilism of Event Horizon that rattled censors. The ship isn't haunted by ghosts. It's possessed by a dimension of pure chaos. There's no escape, no salvation, and no clear explanation. Just madness. Over the years, Event Horizon has earned a cult following. Directors like Christopher Nolan and Guillermo del Toro have cited it as an influence. Fans continue to petition for the lost footage, but most of it is believed to be destroyed. What remains is one of the darkest, most censored sci-fi films of the 90s. A descent into terror that censors couldn't quite contain. Number 8. Gamera, Guardian of the Universe, 1995. While kaiju movies are often seen as campy fun, Gamera, Guardian of the Universe marked a turning point. Directed by Shusuke Kaneko, this reboot of the giant flying turtle monster wasn't just more serious, it was shockingly violent, especially for a genre often aimed at younger viewers. The film centers on Gamera's battle with the carnivorous Gyaos, monsters that slice humans apart with laser screams and devour entire villages. The destruction is brutal, shown in terrifying detail, with blood and body parts flying. For a monster flick, it took an unexpectedly dark turn. Japanese audiences were surprised by the shift in tone, and some local stations refused to air the film without edits. In the Philippines and other Southeast Asian countries, the movie was marketed to children but pulled after complaints from parents about scenes of people being graphically eaten. Even in the US, the dubbed versions were toned down, and TV broadcasts often skipped entire sequences of carnage. Censorship aside, Gamera, Guardian of the Universe reinvigorated the kaiju genre. Its serious tone, high production values, and emotional depth helped it stand out from its predecessors. It was no longer just Godzilla's cousin. It was a creature with purpose and pathos. The film later spawned 2 even darker sequels, turning the Gamera trilogy into one of the most revered sagas in monster movie history. But it all started with a film that dared to show what happens when a kaiju fight isn't just fun and games, it's war. And sometimes, war gets censored. Number 7. The Lawnmower Man, 1992. What happens when man merges with machine, not just physically, but spiritually? The Lawnmower Man took that question and twisted it into a psychedelic nightmare. Directed by Brett Leonard, the film follows a mentally challenged gardener who becomes a cyber god after being subjected to virtual reality experiments. It was controversial from the beginning, not just for its visuals, but for its subject matter. The film's blend of emerging tech, altered consciousness, and escalating violence drew concern from censors across several countries. When the protagonist's transformation turns violent, the film leans hard into surreal horror. A priest is set on fire, people are mentally tortured via cyberspace, and virtual executions are rendered in pulsating, disorienting CGI. Several countries, including Singapore and Malaysia, gave it limited or outright banned releases due to perceived blasphemous and mind-altering content. In the UK, a heavily edited TV version was all that aired. The MPAA gave it an R rating, but threatened an NC-17 if the director didn't soften scenes involving the main character's final rampage. The final cut dialed down some imagery, but even then, the film disturbed audiences. Despite mixed reviews, The Lawnmower Man was a box office success and introduced mainstream viewers to the dangers of VR long before it was reality. Over time, it became a cult curiosity, praised for its ambition, criticized for its portrayal of mental disability, and remembered for being one of the first films to use CGI as a primary storytelling tool. Ironically, the censorship only fed the idea that the Lawnmower Man knew something we didn't. Something dangerous. Something the censors didn't want us to see. Number 6. Natural City, 1999. Though released quietly at the end of the decade, South Korea's Natural City was a visceral shock to anyone expecting a sleek, sanitized sci-fi. Drawing visual and thematic inspiration from Blade Runner, this film explored a dystopian world of cyborgs, dying cities, and desperate humans clinging to love and identity. But where Blade Runner used noir aesthetics and poetic pacing, Natural City added martial arts, body horror, and graphic destruction. The film follows a soldier who falls in love with a cyborg nearing the end of her programmed life. To extend her existence, he betrays his comrades and fights through waves of corruption and violence. Censors in South Korea demanded edits to several sequences where androids are disassembled, limbs torn apart, faces sliced open, mechanical organs rupturing with explosive force. The BBFC also required cuts before a UK release, citing unrelenting brutality and disturbing imagery. The most sensitive element, though, was the ethical question it raised. What does it mean to love something built to die? The film's quiet moments are poetic, but they are shattered by high-voltage bursts of violence that left even sci-fi fans reeling. Though it flew under the radar in the West, Natural City became a sleeper hit among cyberpunk fans and is now seen as a forerunner of modern Korean sci-fi. Its censorship history only adds to its cult appeal. Beneath its shattered cities and broken robots, Natural City reveals something raw: humanity's desperate, bloody fight against oblivion. Number 5. Screamers, 1995. Few sci-fi films from the 90s hit as hard and cut as deep as Screamers. Based on a short story by Philip K. Dick and directed by Christian Duguay, this film takes place on a distant planet ravaged by war. The twist? The deadliest weapons are underground, self-replicating machines that evolve and scream. At first, the machines are just robotic blades. But then they begin building humanoid replicas, perfect mimics that beg for help, then kill. The paranoia grows unbearable, and so does the violence. Censors in the UK and Germany flagged the film for its sudden, jarring gore, dismemberments, shredded torsos, and psychological torment. One notorious scene where a soldier realizes a child is actually a machine seconds before being ripped apart was edited for most international home video releases. In the US, the MPAA gave it an R, but not without protests from religious groups that claimed it was masquerading as sci-fi while promoting apocalyptic horror. In parts of Asia, it faced limited theatrical runs due to its bleak tone and unsettling child violence imagery. Despite the censorship, Screamers garnered a loyal cult following. Its themes of distrust, war's toll on morality, and machines becoming human were ahead of their time. The roughness, both in tone and execution, only added to its raw appeal. Today, it remains a gritty, underseen gem of 90s sci-fi. If Orwell warned us about surveillance, Screamers warned us about weapons learning how to smile. Number 4. Tetsuo, The Iron Man, 1992, US release. Though originally released in Japan in 1989, Tetsuo, The Iron Man hit the US in the early 1990s, and censors didn't know what to do with it. Directed by Shinya Tsukamoto, this black and white nightmare is a sensory overload of metal, flesh, and madness. A man wakes up to find his body slowly transforming into scrap metal. Drills erupt from his face. Wires invade his veins. Steel fuses with skin. American distributors struggle to market it. Was it horror, science fiction, art film, underground cinema? What it was, without question, was brutally transgressive. The MPAA refused to rate it, so most theaters had to release it unrated, making it difficult to find outside of underground and art house venues. Even some indie chains deemed it too disturbing for general showings. UK censors were similarly cautious, demanding age restrictions and placing advisory warnings about graphic body horror and industrial violence. The film's sound design alone, clanking metal, distorted shrieks, and industrial thuds, created unease. Its violence is not constant, but it's grotesque, abstract, and surreal. One scene involving a metal transformation and a subway chase was considered so disturbing it was cut entirely from early German releases. The Iron Man became legendary in cyberpunk circles. While many sci-fi films explore humanity's fusion with technology, this one screams it. It's not clean, it's not sleek, it's rusted, infected, and horrifying. By the time it was fully available uncut in the West, it had already gained mythic status. Brutal, noisy, and defiantly avant-garde, Tetsuo. The Iron Man redefined what it meant to be censored, not because it was too violent, but because it was too visionary. Number 3. Split Second, 1992. In a future London drowning under climate change and constant rain, something horrific stalks the streets. Split Second, starring Rutger Hauer, blends sci-fi and horror into a grungy, cynical vision of urban decay. And while the film flew under the radar at its release, it's now remembered for its atmosphere and its brutality. Hauer plays a hardened detective chasing a serial killer that may not be human. The bodies are mangled, hearts are ripped out, victims are torn in half. And the monster behind it all? A genetically engineered terror that's half human, half alien. Censors in multiple countries, including Australia and Italy, trimmed several sequences of disembowelment and bloodletting. In Japan, the film was released with a strong advisory warning due to its mixture of occultism, extreme gore, and psychological dread. In the US, the MPAA barely let it squeak by with an R. But the studio buried the film, afraid it would be too grim for audiences still craving cleaner sci-fi like Star Trek VI or Total Recall. Yet it's precisely that grimminess that earned Split Second a cult following. The flooded alleys, the black market tech, the monstrous urban paranoia. It all mirrors the fears of 90s audiences staring down climate change, crime waves, and the end of optimism. Today, it's celebrated not only for Hauer's performance, but for showing a future that wasn't chrome and lasers. It was rain, blood, and dread. Number 2. Nemesis, 1992. You've probably never heard of it, but Nemesis might be the most underrated, most brutal cyberpunk film of the decade. Directed by Albert Pyun, it's part Terminator, part Blade Runner, and all bullets, blood, and betrayal. Set in a future where humans and cyborgs are nearly indistinguishable, the film follows an ex-cop turned mercenary who's caught between rebel hackers, corrupt governments, and android assassins. Explosions erupt in slow motion. Bodies crumple under heavy gunfire. and every confrontation feels like a dance of destruction. The violence was unrelenting. So much so that multiple versions exist worldwide, each trimmed to meet different censorship standards. Germany's original release cut over 10 minutes. The UK's version was clipped for violence and gunplay. And even in the US, scenes of facial disfigurement and headshots were toned down. The controversy wasn't just about the gore. It was also about the film's moral ambiguity. In Nemesis, there are no heroes. Everyone is either broken, synthetic, or compromised. Despite the censorship, the film spawned 3 sequels and a loyal fan base. Pune's gritty aesthetic, paired with a shockingly coherent cyberpunk world, made Nemesis an underground hit. Today, it's seen as a raw, flawed gem, one that dared to imagine a future too brutal for mainstream cinema. Number 1. Man's Best Friend, 1993. At first glance, Man's Best Friend looks like a typical killer animal movie. But dig deeper, and you'll find a twisted sci-fi horror story that had censors on edge. Directed by John LaFia, this film follows a genetically engineered dog, bred for military purposes, that escapes into suburbia. The result is both absurd and deeply unsettling. The dog can climb trees, spit acid, rip through steel, and, most disturbingly, mimic human behavior. When it begins killing, it's not just violent, it's strategic. Victims include mailmen, burglars, and even other pets. One scene, where the dog stalks a cat with calculated malice, was so disturbing that multiple countries demanded edits before theatrical release. The BBFC gave it an 18 rating. Australian networks refused to air it on primetime slots. In the US, it was allowed an R rating, but home video versions later included scenes previously deemed too intense for theatrical audiences. Why all the fuss over a killer dog? Because Man's Best Friend tapped into something primal. Our trust in pets, our love for them, and what happens when science corrupts that trust. It was never meant to be just horror. It was a warning about playing God with nature. Over time, it became a cult horror curiosity. Equal parts. Cujo, RoboCop, and Frankenstein. It's the perfect mix of science fiction terror and creature feature gore. And when it comes to censorship, it proved that even a dog can be too brutal for the screen. These weren't just films, they were cinematic gut punches. Banned, butchered, or buried, they dared to show a future we weren't ready to face. If you loved this countdown, hit like, subscribe, and drop your favorite brutal sci-fi in the comments. The future was censored, but here, we remember everything.